Hello everyone. Guys, please come on. Hold your applause. Let's be civil here. Alright. The Homestead Act, signed into law in 1862 by President Lincoln, was created to greatly encourage mass immigration in the Midwest. The act provided settlers with 160 acres of land. But you may ask, what did the settlers moving into the land have to give back to the government? Of course they weren't going to get the land for free. In return, the settlers would have to pay fees and occupy the land for 5 years before fully owning it. When the act was put into place, all Americans were encouraged to immigrate to the west of the United States. The government's decision to ratify the Homestead Act exploded with an outburst of excitement from the people. This sense of excitement and freedom could be felt in every man, woman, and child who immigrated to this strange land. However, the travel was not easy. Abraham Lincoln heavily focused on building a railroad track in the Midwest and around the United States. Therefore, most people immigrated to the West by the newly installed tracks. Had it been 50 years later, they could have taken their cars. The introduction of the train greatly influenced immigration, as it was relatively cheap to buy a ticket, and they were fast-moving vehicles. Of course, not only whites settled here, but also many African Americans and Europeans came to look for a better life. Over time, the act was very successful in achieving its task of populating the West, which would create the America we know today.
Additionally, the act appealed to African Americans because they sought to escape the poor treatment they were experiencing in the South. Black people immigrating to the West were also called exodusters. The expansion altered many people's lives because they had to change their whole lifestyle. First, they had to move to an entirely different part of the country. To further the change, they had to farm on poor soil because the soil in the West wasn't as good as it was in the North and South. People immigrated to this area primarily to own their own land. This appealed to African Americans because it was a better version of sharecropping, which is a form of farming where blacks would have to, at harvest time, give half of the year's crop they grew to the owner of the land just to remain on the land. Now you can see why this act appeals to them. They can now own their own land and not have to relinquish any of their crop, which is why it did. The expansion also provoked conflict between the people who immigrated to the West and the original proprietors of the land, the Native Americans. The settlers were basically invading their land for farming, and the Native Americans didn't appreciate it. Settlers would have to try and find a way to share the land with the Indians without causing a huge conflict. However, with their best efforts, conflict did emerge between the two. White settlers would end up driving out the natives and sending them to reservations and/or Indian schools, which would help them learn and use American culture rather than their Indian culture. And white and blacks would pour into the Midwest for farming. Now let's talk. The Homestead Act was in full effect for 123 years. From 1862 to 1976, the Homestead Act filled 10% of the U.S. land. This greatly increased the United States density. There were also men, women, and children immigrating to the U.S. from Europe. This caused the U.S. population to skyrocket. The population increase was obvious because 4 million people made claims for land under the Homesteading Act. The typical amount of acres within a homestead claim was 160 acres. There were 270 million acres given not only in the Midwest, but also including Alaska and California. Now that's a lot of acres. California is currently the most populated state, so I guess you could say this act did become a success in increasing the United States population, since they're still the most populated state today. So 30 of the 50 states in the U.S. had homesteading all around with locations in them. So this would later influence the United States we know today.
The Homestead Act had a great impact on the United States. It not only grew our population, but helped create a true nation from sea to shining sea. The act also influenced the idea of building a national railroad within the states. Railroads helped greatly with better transportation. In addition, it helped African Americans escape from sharecropping. The act also ultimately helped drive out Native Americans in the Midwest. Though it was not necessarily a positive thing, it was a large effect after the act's ratification. What also greatly increased after the act was diversity. Despite popular belief, there was a lot more ethnicities than just whites who immigrated to the Midwest. People immigrated from many foreign lands in Europe, but also around the world. Many different colors, ethnicities, and cultures were dispersed throughout the United States. This helped create the diversity in America that we know today. The Homestead Act had a significant impact in the United States by populating desolate areas and fulfilling the belief of manifest destiny. If the act had not been put into place, we would live in a totally different world today. Though it had its ups and downs, the Homestead Act was ultimately a vital law for the United States.